It was easy to get into the house unnoticed. David only had to go around the back and open the door to the basement. He couldn't go in from the front because the alarm, installed at the insistence of his wife Brenda, would have gone off. She was completely obsessed with security and pestered David, until he finally installed the system. It would also work for opening the garage door with a delay on the keypad set to 10 seconds was the magic number. 15 seconds was a waste of time, he said. A robber would have time to slip into his bedroom before the system kicked in. He just wanted to give his boyfriend time to get out the window. David joked, but Brenda just laughed and went back to preparing dinner. It made sense, so he reset the delay. Of course, this meant that he would set off the alarm every time he returned home, but that would only last for a few seconds until he got out of the car and entered the fort. You just need to check the digit code every day to make sure it's working. One afternoon, Brenda smiled as he walked into the house, grumbling after turning it off about a dozen times already. The same goes for the windows. They were all under control, but he also knew that no one would notice the wire he ran through the top of the door frame, bypassing the sensor. Brenda almost never went down to the basement, and even if she did, David doubted she would have noticed when he tested it. The panel lit up perfectly, and all the cables were reliable. The door was quiet and the hinges, which he had oiled, moved easily. The same went for the steps, which he had carefully nailed almost a week ago. Brenda was happy about this too. She had been begging him for months to fix the rickety steps. He had tested their strength with his 190 pounds weight, and they were fine. The small .22 caliber Beretta pistol he had tucked into his windbreaker, which hung on hooks at the top of the stairs, held 10 rounds. It felt good to reach into his pocket and find it. David had no intention of shooting anyone unless he had to, but he had no intention of retreating either. Something was going on, and he was determined to find out what it was. There was no point in sorting things out with his wife, Brenda. If something happened, she would deny everything, and if not, he would look stupid. He was worried about years of trying to have children with her, and years of failure. He even went to the doctor to get it checked, and was ridiculed when the old doc told him to try not to hug strange women. David was fertile, but even more so than usual. The old doctor laughed at his joke, patted him on the shoulder, and told him to go to her with a grin. It was Brenda's turn, but instead she went to her own doctor, the same one she had been using since before their wedding. She insisted on this too, that day. David happened to see her leaving the hairdresser. Otherwise, he might not have suspected anything strange. She was supposed to be at her doctor's appointment, but instead she was. Brenda was getting her hair and nails done, but David was just getting ready for work and was already 5 minutes late. It didn't occur to him until he pulled into his garage. It had happened just a month ago that evening. She told him with a sad expression on her face that it was possible she could have children, but that it was unlikely. He held her until she calmed down, feeling sick to his stomach. "We can just keep trying, honey," she told him. But her tone was not entirely correct or entirely truthful. That's when David started to keep his eyes open. He didn't think the black woman from the hair salon was qualified to give Brenda advice on such things. It was treason. It was impossible. Brenda was always home. There were no signs or clues when he came home. She was always there. Of course, there were overnight trips, which he had to make 2 or 3 times a month. Maybe she was addicted to something and was hiding it. That was impossible too. She looked and acted as healthy as a horse. She even had an extra kilo or 2 on her round body. Perhaps she was gambling. She might play in casinos. But a quick check of her finances revealed nothing unusual. Brenda was pretty frugal, but aside from clothes and going to the salon to get her nails done, there was nothing unusual. However, her nails looked good that day. He never understood this part. He heard, "Damn, I broke my nail at least 50 times." Later that evening, while Brenda was taking a shower, David rummaged through her drawer and looked in her closet. Brenda loved beautiful clothes. She had outfits that he had never seen in the dresser drawer. There was a He also saw a small bag of panties, which he found surprising. He'd never seen them before, but he didn't think anything of it. When they went out to dinner or dancing, beautiful outfits and tiny panties always appeared. David enjoyed seeing Brenda come out and pose, knowing how much it pleased him. She was a woman who knew how to turn heads, and she knew it. He chuckled to himself, almost wishing it wasn't Saturday night. He felt proud dancing with her and then later without any. He doubted he would be able to remove her top layers and discover what was underneath this time. Then he found birth control pills. He blushed and managed to pull himself together before she stepped out of the shower. His instinct told him to snap and yell at her, but he had learned to check everything first. Once many years before, he found Jenny, his then-girlfriend, kissing some handsome guy who came to a party. David was ready to ask Jenny the main question, and he knew that she was thinking about it too. He met her parents, and everything was very serious. Then he saw her kissing some guy on the lips, pressing her whole body against him, which was not at all like a friendly kiss on the cheek. He stood there in shock as he watched her excitedly greet the man. David walked up and grabbed the guy, landing him right on his butt. The man turned out to be her brother, whom David had never met. He'd just come home from college for the weekend. The meeting with her brother was supposed to be the main surprise of the evening. Therefore, although Jenny mentioned she didn't tell him that her brother was going to be there that evening, after he'd been thrown out of the house, she didn't even answer his phone calls. He'd barely got to second base with her, and she'd hinted that this day would come. It wasn't just a hint when he arrived that evening. She kissed him, then slipped the package of protection into his shirt pocket, giving him a sly look. Of course, his blow to her brother right in front of everyone put an end to this. He should have thought before he acted. David learned a valuable lesson. His job involved ordering fences for farmers' sheds and paddocks. Sometimes he designed a series of pins himself so that farmers could process their cattle, separate them for trips to auction, or for medical care and the like. The job was great because he met a lot of really nice people and he worked outdoors. His last job was particularly enjoyable. Not only did he sell almost 5 miles of fence, but the family invited him to dinner. They served ham and black bean cornbread, which was much better than the stuff they sell in shops. Paul Edwards was a rough old man, tall and thin. He wore a faded blue long johns, which were clear because his thick work shirt was always unbuttoned. He wore suspenders holding up his heavy work pants. His wife Linda was plump and happy with a smile that never seemed to leave her face. By the end of the day, Paul and David had become good friends. They loved to hunt and fish. Paul somehow became almost the father figure David never had in his own life. It's hard to understand how this could happen. One day, Paul and David were chatting about everything and nothing in particular. The couple had a daughter, Olivia, who was about 25 years old and very attractive, even in casual clothes. She was clearly a beautiful young woman, and she seemed interested in Paul. However, David was married, so there was no hope of anything happening between them. Olivia's name was Olivia. The next day, Paul thought about her all the way home. She was a good person, the kind that a man wants to get to know better. Paul had been raising his ranch on hills with good water. He'd been running herds for many years now, and needed a good fence, several large sheds on stilts. The outside world was moving closer and closer to his land. New people appeared, and didn't like cows and sheep roaming freely across their lawns and flower gardens. So, there was no choice, build fences, or allow the land to be overgrown with houses. Paul chose to build fences, which turned out to be one of his biggest sales to date. The downside of David's job was that most of the big farms were located a long distance away, so he often found himself 300 miles from home, so this place was over 400 miles away in Wyoming. The company paid for his motels and meals on the road, so instead of driving home, David usually rented a motel room and went home the next day. This time was different though. Paul and Linda insisted that he stay the night, ushering him to the large bedroom upstairs. It was so quiet there that David had difficulty falling asleep from time to time. He heard sheep or cows, and each time it was like an alarm clock. The night was warm, and he threw off the blanket around 2 a.m. in the morning. He got up to go to the toilet, and on the way to the corridor he passed another bedroom. The door was slightly open, and a night light was burning. Olivia was lying on top of the blanket, naked, her lower body in shadow, and one bare breast clearly outlined in the dim light of the night lamp. She seemed to be sleeping, but the scene was extremely erotic. David realized that she was certainly a beautiful young woman, but he also quickly looked away. He felt embarrassed about looking at her like that. On his way to bed, he noticed that the bedroom door was now closed, and he blushed. The next morning, Paul and Linda sat Paul down at the kitchen table. There were piles of eggs, ham, and potatoes on the table. They tasted better than anything Paul had ever eaten. "We grow them right here. We have 20 acres of land on the northern ridge." Paul told him about the potatoes, noticing his satisfied look as he took a second helping. Olivia came in, looking around and yawning. She was wearing blue jeans and a flannel shirt, and she looked amazing. She then gave David a sly look, raising one eyebrow seductively, which made him blush. Linda caught her looking between them and grinned. "David," she said. David nodded. "These are very hospitable people," she said. After breakfast, he gathered his things, put the contract and a beautiful check in his briefcase. Time to return home to my own life, he thought. He realized he could live like these people and be happy. Linda handed him a loaf of her cornbread as he climbed into his truck. "Take it," she said. "Thank you," he replied, looking forward to eating it on the long journey home. Olivia stood on the porch and watched what was happening, holding on to the railing. David waved at her as he started his truck and she waved back all the way home. He thought about her, tried to think about something else, but the vision of her lying there naked kept popping up in his head. Brenda kept the house clean and was always there to hug and cuddle him when he visited. These trips rarely lasted longer than one night. David loved coming home after a long trip, but for some reason, after overnight trips, she always wanted to pet him more than usual. Brenda was 34 years old and remained in shape. She was a full blonde and wore her hair in a short updo. She was built and had a great upper body. She also worked in real estate commission sales, which paid pretty well. Some months she made more than him, but that was rare. In the last few years she would often go a month or two without making any sales at all. However, they managed. David knew he could use a new truck. His old big Ford F. The truck was still in good shape, but it was starting to show its age. It could wait because it was paid off. Love and intimacy came a couple of times a week, and Brenda was always delighted. He felt that their life together was pretty good. Of course, there were a few things he would like to improve, but he did his best. The last trip ended in the same way. Brenda was waiting for him and was ready for some cuddles. A few minutes later, they were in the bedroom. The sheets were fresh and crisp as always. When he came home, David handled it well. Even though there was that niggling feeling in the back of his mind while he was busy at work, his mind was full of numbers and plans. He didn't even think about his discovery. Is that what filled his head again? He didn't really have anything solid to base his case on. Perhaps Brenda had 2 appointments that day, both with the doctor and at the hairdresser. New clothes and intimate underwear. Was she really preparing a surprise for him? This actually happened several times. She would come out dressed to the nines, taking part in a nice dinner, and would do that little twirl. While showing off a new dress or a tiny thong with a grin, he still had that nagging suspicion. He just had to find out the truth. Birth control pills meant she'd lied to him. His concern wasn't just because she didn't want a child. He made changes that would allow him to check and find out. He did it right in front of her, and she didn't even notice. All hell broke loose. David drove past his house and looked for an unfamiliar car. It wasn't there, but he didn't expect it to be because they were neighbors. The light was on in the upstairs bedroom, and the curtains were drawn tightly. He had nothing but a sad feeling, and the packet of birth control pills he found in her underwear drawer. Seeing her leave the salon when she was supposed to be at the doctor's was a shock to his system. This is where it all started. If you smell a rat, it's somewhere nearby. Mom told him about this 500 times. David smelled a rat at the top of the stairs. He listened. The only sound he heard was the sound of the shower running. It was strange because it was almost 2 in the morning. He expected her to be asleep or that he would catch her doing whatever she was doing. If she was up and about now, it would be the perfect time to talk to her. He told her his job was in Wyoming, and there was no way he could get home until late the next day. There was even a good job in Wyoming. He organized a telephone sale. Paul and his wife Linda were really happy with the first job, so much so that they didn't invite him to join them. In fact, he was invited, but he had to take part in the auction for another much smaller job located nearby. He briefly considered that he might like it, maybe get some more of that cornbread, and maybe he would be able to see Olivia again. David shook his head to clear his thoughts. He wasn't quite himself at the moment. Stupid thoughts kept creeping into his head. Here he was, standing on the top step of the stairs in his own house, thinking about work and about a woman he barely knew, with a gun in his hand. He was very close to simply. He was tempted to retreat and sneak out of the house, but he had to know everything for sure. If Brenda didn't do anything, he could just sneak away and forget about it. But what if she did? David didn't know what he would do if there was someone there with her. He had this feeling that she was having an affair, although there was no evidence of this. There was no evidence of this, but he had a feeling that something was going on. He stood there for a while, feeling a bit stupid. He listened, but all he could hear was the running shower. Brenda often spent half an hour in the shower, so this wasn't unusual. Finally he slowly pushed the door open, not really expecting to find. David saw a man sitting on the edge of a rumpled bed with his back to the door. The man was fully dressed and reading a magazine. It was David's Popular Mechanics magazine. The man's eyes turned red as he turned the page of the magazine. "Who the hell are you?" David asked, entering the room. The man jumped as if someone had poked him in the ass and turned around, looking at David in shock. It was Matt Johnson, manager of the local bank that Brenda's real estate agency used to close deals. Matt Johnson was about 52 with gray hair at the temples and an imposing figure, a larger man than David. David knew that if there were any worthwhile deals going on in town, Johnson was somewhere nearby. He also knew that although he was tough and fast, he would most likely lose some of his skin if he took on this man. "Hey, it's not what it seems," Johnson shouted, and then saw the gun in David's hand. His eyes widened in fear. "You came to my house to take possession of my wife and my damn bed." David growled at him. "Hey buddy, that's not what it looks like." David would have got to him before he could shoot, but he was on the other side of the bed and had to come out from behind it. David shot him twice and the man fell, groaning loudly. Then he heard Brenda scream and the bathroom door swung open. She was completely naked and wet. "Who is this guy and what the hell is he doing?" David shouted at her. Her hand came up to cover her mouth as she looked at Johnson groaning on the floor. "Honey, it's not what it seems," she said, looking up. "Jesus Christ, are you there washing your ass to keep it clean for this bastard?" David shouted. "No, honey, we were just going to talk, that's all." She whined at 2 in the morning. "It was morning in our bedroom and you were naked. You just needed to take a shower." She looked at him with horror. "You're lying," he said angrily. Brenda did exactly what she was supposed to do, just like on TV. She fell screaming. David watched her for a moment. The vision seemed unreal. It was like he thought he recognized Johnson, but he was sure he'd seen him on the big screen. He walked over and looked at Johnson, who was moaning loudly. He looked at David, his eyes full of fear. "Don't kill me, please," he shouted. David thought about putting a bullet between Johnson's eyes, but decided against it. "You bastard," David told him. Johnson fell silent after a strong blow to the head. David felt stone-cold calm. It was as if all this was happening to someone else. He approached Brenda, who was screaming and crying. "Was it worth it?" he asked her. Brenda didn't answer. She just looked at him with wild eyes. "To hell," he muttered under his breath. Then he picked up the phone from the nightstand. He'd found an intruder in his wife's bedroom and shot him. His wife was injured in a fight. He asked, "Could you please send an ambulance?" He then put the pistol in his belt and went downstairs. He checked the refrigerator and found 6 packs of beer as always. Brenda had done her shopping on the counter, leaving an unopened bag of chips and a jar of mixed nuts, which he knew he liked. David took them and walked into the living room, sitting so he could see the bottom of the stairs. He thought about the job he had just won and started running numbers in his head. The pistol poked him, so he moved it to his side where it was more comfortable. He could hear Brenda sobbing upstairs, so he reached over to the TV and turned it on. Some people were talking, but he had no idea what they were talking about. The chips were tasty, fresh, and good. He was on his second beer and finishing half a bag of chips when he heard the sirens. They weren't in a hurry. On the way to the police station, he was annoyed that he couldn't take the jar of nuts with him. They also treated him roughly. They noticed him eating chips and then saw the gun tucked into his belt. Suddenly, a weapon was pointed at him. Everyone screamed. One policeman reached down and took the gun. David was just stuffing another chip into his mouth when he was grabbed and thrown to the floor. His hands were twisted behind his back. "Ow, you're hurting me," he complained, but no one answered. "Shut up," one of them growled at him. Later, when he asked for his can of nuts, David was told to shut up. It didn't look good. The lawyer David had hired told him that David didn't know this man. He had never needed a lawyer before. One of those who was in prison with him, he mentioned Mercer, McLaren, Hansen, Ireland, and Phillips. It seemed to David that the guy spent a lot of time talking to lawyers. "I used the services of Tom Ireland, who is a great lawyer," he boasted. "So why are you still here?" David asked. He only received a sideways glance, but he needed to find someone, so he called a lawyer. Tom Ireland was a short and stocky man, and he carried a very battered briefcase. He looked over the charges and shook his head. "So what is it?" Next, David asked the man about the in the home to cover it, and that they would wait for the grand jury to hear the case. He then asked how serious the attempted murder charge would be. He said that if the man was going to shoot someone, he should just kill them. If he didn't kill him, the man would testify against him. He said that the man was in complete control of the situation. He then asked why the man was using such a small gun. He said that the man should have gotten a Magnum or something similar. He snorted slightly at this. He then asked how bad things were with them. "Your wife will be fine, just a hole in her side. Johnson is pretty beat up. Those little .22 cartridges tend to burst, so he spent a lot of time in surgery." "Why did you shoot him a second time?" "He was still attacking me." "Well, that shot looks deliberate." "You hit him below the belt," Ireland said, looking at him sideways. "Great," David answered categorically. The lawyer snorted in agreement. "Magnum would have blown them clean off, but you just made a hole between them." He snorted again, almost. It was another month before he was granted bail and allowed to leave prison. The fresh air was a welcome change, but it still smelled of prison. He was not allowed to return home, so he didn't bother trying. Brenda had already been released from the hospital, but he got there first and signed the papers. The place was named Brenda Parker or David Parker, but he didn't care. One of them could have signed the papers. It was one of those little details in the letter of the law. He was surprised that they didn't notice when they signed the papers. He was amazed that Brenda was doing this part now he knew why. But that little moment apparently slipped her mind because she was in the hospital. Tom Ireland was a good lawyer, and he wanted to make sure he got his money. If Brenda wants to keep the apartment, she'll have to pay a few bills. Tom Ireland had one. David had a very large deposit on his apartment. He was broke. He used his savings account to hire a lawyer, and he knew full well that the fee was just the beginning. He also knew full well that this would anger Brenda, but he didn't care. His truck was parked where he had left it down the street and around the corner. He believed it was more than 100 meters, just like the restraining order said, but he wasn't sure. The truck had a dozen parking tickets on it, and it was surprising it hadn't been towed yet. David took the tickets and threw them in the trash. What will they do? Arrest him at the office? David came in to talk to his boss. He seemed very nervous and then told David that they no longer needed him since he was not available and they had to hire someone else. David understood everything. He'd already seen the articles in the newspapers that night. He curled up in his truck, enjoying the place. He'd driven into it. It was called Green Park. It seemed like the joke was on it. The next day, he called a lawyer, and Tom Ireland somehow arranged for a policeman to go with him and pick up some of his things. Maybe he wasn't such a bad lawyer after all. Brenda was nowhere to be seen. David grabbed his clothes, his instruments, and both of his collectible Fender guitars. He also took his fishing gear, in all 4 coin collections. He thought about getting a new big screen TV, but there was nowhere to plug it in. On his way out, he noticed a jar of mixed nuts still sitting. On the rack by the chair, he grinned and grabbed it. He looked into the refrigerator and started to grab the last 5 bottles of beer, but the cop gave him a disapproving look and he left them. Then on the porch, he changed the access code to the alarm system to something else right in front of the policeman, who didn't even notice. He chuckled to himself at the petty act. A local store gave him $400 for 2 guitars and all of his fishing rods except one, which he kept for himself. $200 in cash was he had very little left in the world. He went to the post office where he and Brenda rented a mailbox. His key didn't work, so Brenda cut it off and changed the key. However, they had his mail. The clerk wasn't supposed to pass the mail over the counter, but he asked her directly, noticing the fear on her face when she saw him. She quickly handed him the pack, which contained several credit card applications and forms. One for a funeral home seemed appropriate. He also rented another box and filled out the necessary paperwork with the court so that they would have his address. He actually considered just driving away, but he was driving a monstrous red Ram 1500, so he figured he'd be easy to find. 2 weeks later, David still couldn't find a job. His unsmiling face had been on the news for days. The newspapers wrote about an overly jealous and insane husband who burst into a home business meeting and simply started shooting. He guessed where this Matt Johnson, an influential local businessman, said that his lawyer was right. If he was going to go to all the trouble of shooting someone, he'd better kill them. Otherwise, this is exactly the kind of thing that will turn out wrong. He returned to Green Park, his new home. Driving his truck into the bushes, he took out a fishing rod and caught 6 small grasshoppers. He caught trout from a nearby stream that were at least 18 centimeters long. He roasted them on a small fire he'd built. He was just putting the frying pan into the stream when his mobile phone rang. It was his old boss. He sounded sweet and friendly. What the hell, thought David. He remembered that job he'd done fencing on Paul Edwards' farm in Wyoming. He'd certainly done more than 5. He's got 0,0,0,0 acres and wants the larger area to be fenced with a transverse fence, 2 barns and a fence right up to the city limits. This will be the biggest job we've ever done. What does this have to do with me? David asked. He was still slightly furious at how he had been treated, but lately everyone had treated him in such a way that he spent almost all of his time. Edwards says, he'll hire someone else if you don't take the job. David knew he shouldn't have left the state, but his boss asked him what he should do. David didn't know what to say. Then it dawned on him. Maybe you should go back to your job. No. Well, then how about double commissions? Double yes and return to full-time as money. That's what they say. Do you have a weapon? I'm not allowed to have one. The police took mine. This made David angry. He didn't run around and shoot everyone. He only shot 2 people. He wasn't a psycho. He just fired in all directions. If something irritated him in the newspapers, everything looked exactly like this. What about my salary? I was unfairly dismissed. I couldn't even explain anything. This has been going on for several months, plus half my salary, plus my benefits. David knew he was the company's best salesman. He was the one who got the job done. He could almost hear the wheels turning. He also understood perfectly well that the profit would be only 90 cents per half meter, but 5,000 acres, literally miles of hedges, sheds on poles, one of which is 40 by 20 millions. It was crap. Okay, agreed. That was his boss. David went down to the little corner store and bought himself a jar of mixed nuts to celebrate. He also bought a bottle of beer, which was prohibited, but he didn't care. He drank it quickly and buried the bottle. The judge looked at David and his lawyer with a raised eyebrow, but he approved the request to cross state lines as part of his work and also had to return every evening. You're facing some serious charges, Mr. Parker. I cannot deprive a person of the right to do their job until the case is resolved, so don't screw this up or I'll throw you back in jail. Yes, Your Honor, David replied, keeping a straight face. The next day he was on his way to Wyoming's Paul greeted him with a smile and a handshake. It was clear that the news hadn't reached him yet, so David saw no reason to bring it up. We plant corn in that little spot by the creek. There's good soil on the south side. We need to keep the sheep away from it. Then there's Angus. We kept them free range, but there's a lot of construction going on. I'm just tired of hearing the screaming, so we want to keep them on our land. This old guy must be loaded. By the time they got back to the ranch house, it was almost 7 p.m. David knew he had to leave to get back to Oregon before midnight. He hated the thought of giving up dinner and the chance to see Olivia again, but he had to leave. He left back in Oregon. He called, but only got an automated voice. He called again as soon as the bail office opened. Damn day, just follow the rules. The person who answered told him, okay. He replied, no one ever checks anything unless something happens that catches their attention. He got back into his truck and drove back to the Edwards farm. He drove at top speed. As soon as he arrived, he noticed Olivia sitting on the porch. She jumped up and ran inside. A few seconds later, she returned with a large hat and a basket. She was wearing cut-off blue jeans and a t-shirt. She told him as she climbed into the truck, Dad told me to show you the area near the building site so that you can take measurements today. Everyone is busy cutting hair, he said. Yes, it's a busy day, she replied. Everyone will be busy until dark. It took over an hour to get to the area they were talking about. Cattle wandered around, not paying attention to them. On the way, they talked about everything in the world. He glanced at her every now and then, loving that her breasts bounced with each bump in the road as they drove through open fields. There was no road, just the odd track that looked like an ATV trail. He thought about how long it had been since he'd been with a woman, but pushed the thought away. Work was more important, and he didn't want to do anything that would upset her parents. David came to a large rise in the trail and saw a fairly large river. About half a mile away, there was a row of 3. They continued down and were out of sight. It looked very strange, completely out of place in this seemingly wilderness. Then on the other side, he noticed a highway with cars rushing past at high speed. Progress, he thought. David.